The divorce hearing should have been the happiest day of Vanessa's life. She had spent weeks preparing for it, choosing the right outfit, rehearsing the right expressions, briefing the right lawyers. She had imagined this morning 100 times, and in every version of it she walked away with everything. The house, the accounts, the reputation, the last word. So when she stepped out of her polished black luxury SUV in front of the county courthouse and spotted her ex-husband pulling into the far end of the parking lot in a rust-streaked, dented pickup truck with a cracked side mirror and a bumper held together by time and pure stubbornness, she did not even try to hide her reaction. She laughed. She laughed loud enough for her attorney, Margaret Hollins, to turn and look. She laughed loud enough for her two closest friends, standing nearby, both dressed as though they had arrived for a charity gala, rather than a legal proceeding to exchange, knowing smiles and nod along with the satisfaction of people who had been predicting this outcome for years. That, Vanessa said, gesturing toward the truck with the casual cruelty of someone who believed she had already won, is what happens when you spend your whole life pretending to be more than you are. Ethan parked the truck carefully, as he always did, along the edge of a space far from the other vehicles. He climbed out slowly, wearing dark slacks and a plain button-down shirt. No tie. No watch on his wrist worth mentioning to anyone who passed. He carried a single manila folder under one arm. He did not rush. He did not look over at the group watching him. He simply walked toward the courthouse entrance with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere more important to be, and yet somehow gave the impression that he was managing a schedule that no one else in the parking lot could fully comprehend. A few reporters gathered near the courthouse steps, tipped off that this hearing involved a business dispute with significant financial stakes, glanced at him, and then glanced away, unimpressed. One of Vanessa's friends leaned close to Margaret and whispered something. Margaret smiled thinly. Everyone in that parking lot, in that moment, had already made up their minds about Ethan Cole. They had decided what he was. They had categorized him, discounted him, and moved on to more interesting subjects. Everyone except Ethan himself. He paused near the courthouse steps, reached into his jacket pocket, and checked his watch, a simple analog piece, the kind a man buys once and wears until it becomes something personal rather than decorative. And then he did something no one quite registered in real time, but would remember very clearly later. He smiled, not at anyone, not in the direction of Vanessa or her entourage. He smiled the way a person smiles when they are the only one in the room who knows the punchline. And they have decided, in the name of patience and dignity, to wait for everyone else to catch up. Then he tucked the folder under his arm again and walked inside. Vanessa watched him go and felt nothing but confirmation. She was absolutely certain. Today was her day. There had been a time, not so many years ago, when Vanessa Carlton had looked at Ethan Cole and seen something entirely different. She had seen possibility. She had seen a man who woke before sunrise and fell asleep at his desk and argued with himself in low murmurs over problems that no one had asked him to solve. She had found that quality electric in the beginning, the relentlessness of him, the way he approached every obstacle as though it were a personal insult that deserved a systematic and permanent response. They had met at a regional business conference in the summer, nearly 9 years before the courthouse morning, when Ethan was running a small consulting firm out of a 2-room office, and Vanessa was working in marketing for a mid-sized firm that her father had partially financed. She had been drawn to him not for what he had, which was modest at that point, but for the quality of his attention. When Ethan Cole listened to someone speak, he listened the way most people read a contract, as if every word might matter later, as if context and implication deserved the same respect as plain fact. Vanessa had never been listened to that way before, and she had mistaken the experience for love, which in some ways it was, and in other ways it was something more fragile than she understood. They married 18 months after that first conference. The wedding was small and clean, in a rented garden on the edge of the city, and Vanessa wore a dress she had found in a vintage shop on a Saturday afternoon when Ethan was working, and she had needed something to do with her hands. The dress cost less than $200, and she had not told her mother that. In the photographs from that afternoon, she was smiling in the unguarded way that people only smile when they are not thinking about how they look. Ethan stood beside her with his hand resting lightly at her waist, already planning, even then, the next chapter of something only he could fully see. The early years were lean but purposeful. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator worked 3 days out of 5. They drove used cars. They ate at home most nights, and saved carefully, and reinvested everything that could be reinvested. Vanessa worked and contributed and believed, during those years, that she understood the life she had chosen. She believed it until the life she had chosen began to succeed. And then the life she had imagined began to seem like not quite enough. Those early years had their own quiet dignity. Ethan would come home from the office late, sometimes past 10 or 11 at night, and he would find Vanessa at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a book. And there was something right about those evenings, something that fit the shared smallness of it, the sense of two people building something together from the bottom up with no guarantee it would ever be more than what it was at that moment. They had arguments, as all couples do, mostly about time, which was the thing in shortest supply, and which Ethan invested with the same stubborn focus he brought to everything professional. Vanessa wanted more evenings, more weekends, more of his attention turned in her direction rather than outward toward the perpetual horizon of the next project, the next contract, the next iteration of a solution to a problem that, as far as she could see, had not yet found its market. And Ethan, who was not an emotionally absent man but was genuinely and completely absorbed in what he was building, understood this as something to be addressed later. Once the foundation was solid enough, once the uncertainty of the early phase resolved into the reliability of growth, he intended to give her more. He intended to give her everything, eventually. He simply needed a little more time, and time was the one thing that their marriage, as it turned out, was going to run out of first. It happened gradually, the way most important changes do, in increments so small they are invisible until suddenly they are not. Ethan's consulting work evolved steadily. He brought in a partner named Daniel Marsh, a quiet and precise man with a background in software architecture and a reputation in technical circles that was larger than his public profile suggested, and the two of them began pursuing a project that Ethan described in general terms as a platform solution for enterprise logistics optimization, which Vanessa understood to mean technology, and which she privately suspected meant years of additional sacrifice for a reward that might never fully arrive. She was patient in the first year of that project. She was patient, though increasingly restless, in the second. By the 3rd year, Vanessa had begun spending more time with a circle of acquaintances whose relationship to money was entirely different from Ethan's. These were people who had inherited wealth, or married it, or acquired it through the kind of deal-making that produced results quickly and visibly. And in their company, Vanessa began to feel a slow and corrosive comparison forming in the back of her mind between the life she had and the life that seemed available, just beyond the edge of where she currently stood. She was not a cruel woman by nature. She was simply a woman who had decided, somewhere in the quiet hours of her discontent, that she deserved more, and had not yet fully examined what that belief was going to cost the person standing closest to her. The man who accelerated that shift was named Harrison Burke. He was 41, recently divorced himself, and ran a real estate investment portfolio that generated the kind of income which expressed itself in penthouse addresses and box seats in restaurants, where the menu carried no prices because the clientele was not meant to concern itself with such details. Vanessa met him at a rooftop event hosted by a mutual friend on a warm evening in September, and Harrison Burke treated her with the kind of elaborate and expensive attention that she had been quietly starving for without fully admitting it to herself. He was charming, in the way that certain wealthy men learn to be charming efficiently and with the right calibration for the audience, and Vanessa found herself returning to his company again and again over the following months, each time with a slightly more elaborate explanation for Ethan about where she had been and who she had been with. Ethan was working late most nights. He was in the middle of something critical, something that required the full measure of his concentration, and so the explanations Vanessa offered were accepted with a distracted nod and a trust that she had not yet decided she wanted to break, but was already in the process of breaking. The parties became a fixture, and then a routine, and then something that Vanessa no longer felt the need to explain or justify even to herself. She learned to navigate that world with the adaptive intelligence of someone who understands what is required of her and provides it efficiently. She learned which topics generated the right kind of attention, which opinions tracked with the room, which version of herself landed best among people who valued a certain kind of poise and a certain kind of backstory. She was good at it, better than she had expected to be, and that competence gave her a kind of confidence that she slowly began to contrast against the life she returned to at the end of those evenings, the leased office space, the deferred decisions, the man at the kitchen table with his laptop, and his unshakable conviction that the thing he was building was worth the time it was taking. Vanessa began to feel, with increasing intensity, that she was caught between two versions of a life, and that the version she was returning home to was falling further and further behind. Her friends, two women named Claire and Simone, who had been circling the edges of the wealthy social world long enough to develop strong opinions about it, encouraged her with the enthusiasm of people who had something to gain from her unhappiness. Claire told her repeatedly that Ethan would never reach the level she needed. Simone was more direct. She said that Vanessa was wasting what she had, meaning her looks, her intelligence, her potential for a different and more impressive life, on a man who was always on the verge of something that never quite materialized. What neither Claire nor Simone understood, what Vanessa herself did not understand, was that the thing Ethan was on the verge of had, in fact, already arrived. He had simply chosen not to tell anyone yet. Not even his wife. The morning Vanessa filed the petition, she stood in the bathroom of their home for a long time and looked at the reflection of a woman who had made a decision and knew there was no clean way back from it. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was simply recognizing a reality that had existed for some time and acting on it before it acted on her. She told herself that the numbers on that laptop screen represented a truth about Ethan she deserved to share, given everything she had contributed. Every year she had waited, every quiet evening she had spent in an apartment that was never quite enough for the life she had imagined when she said yes in that rented garden 7 years before. What she did not tell herself, what she would spend a long time unable to admit, was that the timing was not about fairness. The timing was about fear. The fear that if she waited until the transaction became public, she would be in a far weaker position. The fear that the man she had been underestimating for years had, in fact, been building something she did not fully understand and had not been permitted to fully see. The discovery Vanessa made came not through any grand confrontation but through a left-open laptop on a Tuesday evening in March. She had not been looking for anything. She had been reaching for a phone charger, but the screen was open to an email exchange between Ethan and Daniel Marsh, and a name in the subject line caught her eye. The name was a firm she had heard mentioned in financial circles, a major venture capital organization that did not typically engage with companies operating out of leased office space in secondary markets. The email discussed terms. It used numbers that Vanessa initially read as formatting errors, as misplaced decimal points, because the actual figures attached to them were so far outside the range of what she had assumed their situation to be, that her brain declined to process them correctly on the first pass. She read the email 3 times. Then she closed the laptop and stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The room perfectly quiet around her. Only the sound of the refrigerator and something distant in the street outside, and the entire architecture of the story she had been telling herself about their marriage, rearranging itself in a way she could not yet fully measure. She did not ask Ethan about it that night. She did not ask him the next night either. What she did instead was contact Margaret Hollins. She had been referred to Margaret by Simone 6 weeks earlier, in what had been framed as a casual, just-in-case kind of consultation, the sort of thing sensible women arranged as a precaution without it meaning anything definitive. Now Vanessa called Margaret back with a different kind of urgency. She needed to move quickly, Margaret told her, before any major financial events became part of the public record, and therefore significantly harder to claim through the standard mechanisms of equitable distribution. Vanessa did not fully understand all of the legal implications, but she understood speed. She filed the divorce petition on a Thursday morning without telling Ethan it was coming. She had the papers served to him at his office, through a courier who appeared between 2 scheduled meetings and handed him an envelope with the tone of someone delivering ordinary correspondence. Ethan accepted the envelope, read the contents, and thanked the courier. He then walked back to his desk, made 3 phone calls in close succession, and returned to work. What the people who watched the public phase of this divorce never saw was the private phase of it, the period between the serving of papers and the courthouse morning, which Ethan navigated with a self-possession that would have surprised people who believed they understood who he was. He told his daughter that he and her mother were going to live in separate houses for a while, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, with the straightforward gentleness of a parent who has decided that children are owed the truth in language they can hold. Lily had asked if it was because of something she did. Ethan had told her no, with an immediacy and certainty that he hoped she felt land fully, that it was never about her, that some things between adults were simply complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the people who were loved most. Lily had thought about this, and then asked if she could have cereal for dinner. He had said yes. They had eaten cereal together in the kitchen of the house, where she would eventually not live anymore, and she had told him about a bird she had seen on the school playground that was, in her assessment, definitely some kind of rare species, and he had agreed that it very possibly was, and the evening had been as ordinary and as essential as any evening he could remember. What happened in the days that followed was described by people who witnessed pieces of it as a campaign of managed narrative. Vanessa told her version of the marriage to everyone who would listen, and several people who would have preferred not to. She described financial irresponsibility. She described neglect. She described a husband who had failed to provide adequately, which required some creative editing of the actual circumstances of their life together, but which she delivered with enough conviction and emotional texture that it landed as credible to those who did not know the full picture. Ethan did not defend himself publicly. He did not issue any corrections. He continued driving the old truck, wearing the plain clothes, keeping the same unbroken schedule, and meeting with the same lawyers, a firm so quiet and so specifically excellent that they did not advertise, and their clients did not discuss them unless asked directly. Vanessa had dismissed his legal representation as underpowered. She had been told by Margaret that the other side was not well-resourced, and that the proceedings would be straightforward. Vanessa had believed this because she wanted to believe it, and because she had not yet learned that the absence of visible power is not the same thing as the absence of power. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom of Judge Patricia Okafor was fuller than a standard divorce proceeding warranted. Word had spread in the narrow channels through which legal community gossip travels that there was something unusual about this case, though no one could have stated precisely what it was. Margaret Hollins arrived with a full team of 4 attorneys and a rolling cart of organized binders representing months of methodical preparation. Ethan arrived with 2 attorneys, one of whom was a woman named Beverly Crane, who had the compact, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades saying the exact number of words required and not one more, and who had developed, over the course of a long career, a specific and well-earned reputation for walking into rooms that other people believed to be settled and leaving them significantly unsettled. Vanessa sat on her side of the aisle, with Claire and Simone behind her, and the confidence of a person who has already written the ending and is now simply waiting for the room to catch up. Ethan sat across from her with his folder and his quiet. He looked at nothing in particular. He answered preliminary questions without elaboration. He waited. Margaret Hollins opened with precision and momentum. She established the marriage timeline. She characterized Ethan's financial contributions as inconsistent and opaque. She submitted documentation intended to paint a picture of a woman who had subsidized a partnership that never fully reciprocated, and she did all of this with the practiced fluency of an attorney who had won this type of proceeding many times before and expected to win it again today. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats with the settled satisfaction of those who believe they are watching something inevitable unfold on schedule. Vanessa allowed herself one measured glance at Ethan during the opening arguments and felt a small electric surge of triumph at his continued stillness. He was not objecting. He was not reacting. He was giving her exactly what she had expected him to give, which was nothing. She interpreted the nothing as defeat. She had not yet understood that what she was watching was patience, the deliberate and practiced patience of a man who had built everything he owned by knowing precisely when to wait and precisely when to move, and who had made, in this case, a very clear decision about which of those 2 things the present moment required. Margaret made a point of mentioning the vehicle. It was not strictly relevant to the financial arguments she was constructing, but she understood the value of a vivid image in a room where impressions mattered. She described the truck Ethan had arrived in as representative of his general approach to financial management: careless, outdated, insufficiently attentive to the signals that such choices sent to the world. She suggested, with the delicate insinuation that skilled attorneys deploy when they want an idea in the room without being directly accountable for putting it there, that a man who drove a vehicle in that condition to his own divorce hearing was perhaps not a man who took seriously the weight of his financial obligations. The gallery murmured with the brief, gratified sound of an audience that has been given what it came expecting. Vanessa looked at Ethan, and for one unguarded moment, allowed herself to feel the full measure of contempt that she had been carefully managing for the past several months. Ethan did not look back at her. He was checking his watch again. He was looking at it with the particular focused attention of someone awaiting a scheduled event, and when he looked up again, there was that expression, the punchline smile, the patient certainty of a man who has set something in motion and is simply waiting for everyone else to feel it arrive. The sound came first. A deep and controlled mechanical presence in the sky. The kind produced by aircraft engines operating at approach power, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that shakes windows, but in the controlled silence of a courtroom proceeding loud enough to interrupt the current of Margaret's argument and rotate every head in the room toward the windows. Judge Okafor set down her pen. A bailiff moved toward the window at the side of the room and looked out with the uncertain expression of someone who does not know what they are looking for, but is reasonably sure they will know it when they see it. The sound deepened slightly, and then leveled, and then acquired the particular quality of descent, of approach, of arrival. Outside, visible through the upper portion of the courthouse window, if you tilted your head at the correct angle, a sleek private aircraft with clean white livery had turned onto its final approach to the executive airfield, located less than half a mile from the courthouse grounds. The plane was close enough to see clearly. Its engines were quiet for their class, the way expensive things often are, their power expressed not in noise but in performance. "What is that?" one of Vanessa's friends said from the gallery, in a whisper that was not quite quiet enough. No one answered. But the answer was on its way. The aircraft touched down with the unhurried precision of something operated by people who were very good at their work and had no reason to rush. It taxied quickly to the private terminal, the engine cycling down to ground idle. Within 4 minutes of its landing, a man in a dark suit emerged from the terminal building at a pace that was purposeful and direct. He crossed the access road, checked something on his phone without breaking stride, and continued toward the courthouse entrance. He reached the building in under 3 minutes. The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. The man was young, early 30s, and he scanned the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had been given one task and intended to complete it cleanly. His eyes found Ethan in less than 5 seconds. "Mr. Cole," he said. The room fell into a silence so complete that the ventilation system in the ceiling became briefly, incongruously audible. "They're ready when you are," the man continued, stepping forward and extending a sealed portfolio case with both hands. "Mr. Marsh said to tell you the signature window opens in 22 minutes. Ethan accepted the case without any visible change in his expression. He did not stand up immediately. He set the case on the table in front of him, unfastened the clasp with practiced ease, and examined the top document. He read it with the same focused calm he brought to everything, moving his eyes line by line down the page, the way a man reads something important for the last time, before it becomes permanent and unrevocable. Then he placed the document face down, looked at Beverly Crane, who gave a single brief nod of the kind that contains a great deal of compressed information, and then looked at Judge Okafor, who had set down her pen and was watching him with the expression of a person who has managed unexpected developments before and is already adjusting her mental model of the proceeding. He looked, finally, at Vanessa. She was staring at him. The composure she had maintained through the entire morning was still in place on the surface, but it had changed in quality, the way a wall that still stands can nevertheless show in its surface the complete record of everything that has struck it. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the portfolio case to the man in the dark suit and back to Ethan, and some previous calculation behind those eyes was visibly in the process of being revised. She had spent months constructing a version of events in which she held the dominant position, in which the man in the plain shirt was the diminished party, in which her lawyers and her friends and the courtroom gallery would confirm, through their collective weight, that she had been right about everything. She was experiencing, in real time, the specific and irreversible sensation of that construction being questioned from the ground floor up. Beverly Crane rose from her seat with the unhurried authority of someone who has been waiting for precisely this moment and prepared for it with comprehensive thoroughness. She submitted 4 documents to the clerk and addressed the court in a clear, measured voice that carried to every corner of the room without appearing to try. "The documents," she explained, reflected the completed acquisition agreement between Ethan Cole's firm, Meridian Systems, and a consortium of institutional investors, led by a private equity group headquartered in New York. The transaction, finalized 2 days prior, placed Meridian Systems at a valuation of $4.7 billion. Ethan Cole's personal stake in the company, held through a holding structure that had been in place and fully documented for 6 years before the marriage began to deteriorate, before the first consultation with Margaret Hollins, before any of the events that had brought everyone to this room today, represented a 31% equity position. The partial sale of that stake, completed the previous evening, had generated proceeds that Beverly Crane stated aloud in a tone that was perfectly flat and completely informational, and landed in the room like something dropped from a very considerable height onto very hard floor. Margaret Hollins did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she looked down at her binders with the expression of someone checking a map and finding that the road they have been driving confidently does not, in fact, exist. Then she looked at Vanessa. Vanessa was not looking at her. Vanessa was looking at Ethan. She was looking at the man in the plain button-down shirt and the simple watch and the rust-streaked truck in the parking lot outside, and she was recalculating everything, the entire architecture of her understanding of who he was and what their marriage had been, and what she was sitting in this courtroom about to receive, and the recalculation was not going in any direction that favored the position she had arrived here, intending to defend. Beverly Crane continued. She introduced a second set of documents. These were communications, time-stamped and forensically authenticated, retrieved from accounts associated with Vanessa Carlton Cole. The communications showed, in language that required absolutely no interpretation, a coordinated effort between Vanessa, Harrison Burke, and a third-party legal consultant to accelerate the divorce filing, specifically in advance of the Meridian Systems transaction becoming part of the public record. The communications referenced the laptop email Vanessa had read in March. They referenced a specific legal strategy for claiming marital interest in the company's accumulated valuation, despite the company having been incorporated, funded, and developed almost entirely through Ethan's professional relationships, intellectual contributions, and premarital capital reserves. One message, sent from Vanessa's personal account to Harrison Burke at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, approximately 3 weeks before the petition was filed, conveyed, in its essential substance, that if things moved fast enough, she would clear enough to not need to worry about anything for a very long time. The court was given a moment to allow the implications to settle. Vanessa's face had gone a specific shade of pale that is different from ordinary paleness, the kind that comes not from cold or fatigue, but from the particular internal experience of watching something you believe to be private become public in front of an audience that includes a sitting judge. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and they were folded with excessive precision, with the overly controlled stillness of someone concentrating very hard on keeping one external thing in order, while everything internal refuses to cooperate. Margaret had leaned close and was speaking in a rapid, low voice. But whatever Margaret was saying did not appear to be reaching Vanessa in any functional way. Vanessa was watching Ethan, and Ethan, for perhaps the first time that morning, allowed himself to look back at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the quietly exhausted expression of a man who had loved someone, lost that love, and had now arrived at the far shore of the experience, where everything was finally, irreversibly clear. Judge Okafor called a brief recess. During the recess, the reporter in the back row sent 3 messages and made 2 phone calls and opened a new file. Claire and Simone left the courtroom together without speaking to anyone, their heels rapid and purposeful on the marble floor. Margaret Hollins conferred with Vanessa in a corner of the hallway in a conversation involving the gestures that attorneys make when the landscape of a case has shifted entirely and the available options have narrowed to considerably fewer than the client was promised. Vanessa stood with her arms crossed and her eyes somewhere in the middle distance, with the unfocused quality of a person doing rapid and deeply uncomfortable internal accounting. She had come to this courthouse expecting to leave with the largest possible share of something she had decided she deserved. She had not expected the thing itself to be this large. She had not expected the truth about it to be told in this way, in this room, in front of these particular people on this particular morning. She had not expected the man she had spent months characterizing as a failure to own the aircraft that was presently sitting on a nearby airfield waiting for him. When court resumed, Ethan was given the floor at Beverly Crane's invitation and Judge Okafor's permission. He stood without ceremony, without any visible modification of his manner to suit the drama of what had already occurred. And he spoke the way he had always spoken to people he wanted to actually reach directly, without decoration, without performance. He said that he had not driven the truck to the courthouse that morning as any kind of statement. He said he drove it because he had driven it the morning he signed the papers incorporating Meridian Systems, and the morning they closed their first major client contract, and the morning his daughter was born, and he intended to drive it for a long time to come, because some things deserve to be kept, not because they are valuable in any market sense, but because of what they represent in the private accounting of a life. He said he bore no particular anger. He said that marriage was something he had entered into with full intention, and that watching it deteriorate had been one of the genuinely painful experiences of his adult life, not because of what it cost him financially, or professionally, those were recoverable, but because of the specific quality of the disillusionment, the recognition that the person he had trusted with the most private and unguarded version of himself had made a decision to treat that trust as a resource, as something to be managed and leveraged rather than honored. He said that the hardest thing about betrayal, in his experience, was not the act itself. The hardest thing was the revision. It required the going back through memory and understanding which moments were real and which were already something else by the time they were happening. That was the work that did not end quickly. That was the thing that stayed. He paused. The room was completely quiet in the way rooms become when something true is being said aloud by someone who is saying it not for effect but because it needs to be said, and today is the day it gets said. He said he wished Vanessa well. He said that was not sarcasm or performance, and he wanted it understood as neither. It was simply what he actually wished, that whatever life she arranged for herself going forward would be one that she was genuinely suited to, one that brought her something more durable than the things she had been pursuing. He said that his daughter deserved to be raised by parents who could be civil to one another, and that he intended to be civil, and that he hoped the same could be said of her in time. Then he sat down. The room remained quiet for several seconds after he finished. Judge Okafor looked at the documents before her before she spoke, and when she spoke it was in the careful, precise register of a person who has managed unexpected complexity over many years on the bench, and has developed the ability to identify, without ceremony, what a situation actually is, and what the correct response to it must be. She noted for the record that the financial disclosures submitted by Beverly Crane's team would require detailed review before any final determination could be made regarding asset division. She noted that the communications submitted as exhibits raised questions about the intent underlying the filing timeline that would be directly relevant to her assessment of the petition's equitable merits. She noted that the court would reconvene in 3 weeks. Then she looked briefly at Vanessa with the expression of a woman who has no personal feelings in the matter but has arrived at very clear professional conclusions. And she rose, and the bailiff called the room to its feet, and the day's proceedings were over. The walk out of the courthouse took less time than the walk in but felt considerably longer. Margaret Hollins moved through the lobby with the slightly compressed velocity of someone managing a professional embarrassment of a magnitude she had not anticipated when she accepted the retainer. Vanessa walked beside her wearing the particular expression of someone who has not yet decided how to reframe what just happened, who is still somewhere in the middle distance between one narrative and another, mid-revision, the old story no longer usable, and the new one not yet built. Harrison Burke, reached by phone 40 minutes later in his penthouse, would have no comment and would not return subsequent calls. The gallery emptied slowly, the way audiences leave a theater after something unexpected, with the lingering gait of people not yet ready to finish processing what they witnessed. Conversations formed in clusters on the courthouse steps, and in the parking lot, and along the sidewalk outside, the kind of conversations that begin with, "Did you know?" and "I never would have thought," and which are ultimately less about the subject under discussion than about the pleasure of having been present for something that will be worth retelling. The reporter who had arrived expecting a minor story was already speaking to his editor on the phone, gesturing with one free hand in the way that journalists do when they are trying to convey urgency without sounding excitable. The story, as it would eventually appear, would carry a headline that no one in that parking lot that morning could have written. The photographs attached to it would show Ethan's old truck parked 3 rows from the courthouse entrance, unremarkable in every visible detail, which was precisely the point. Ethan walked out into the afternoon with Beverly Crane and his other attorney, a quiet and thoughtful man named Marcus Webb, and they discussed the timeline for the continued proceedings with the efficient practicality of people who have done this kind of work before and understand exactly what comes next. The man who had brought the portfolio case was waiting near the entrance, and Ethan thanked him and told him to inform the pilot there would be a 2-hour delay before departure. He walked his attorneys to their car, shook Beverly Crane's hand with the genuine warmth of someone expressing real gratitude rather than professional courtesy, and watched them drive away. The parking lot had thinned considerably. The luxury SUV was gone. The reporters were in their own vehicles, filing stories that would look very different from the ones they had arrived expecting to write. The courthouse steps had the quiet, slightly flattened quality that civic spaces acquire in the late afternoon when the day's particular human drama has run its course. The executive airfield across the road was still, the white aircraft waiting on the apron with its stairs lowered and its engines at idle, patient as everything Ethan had ever built. Outside the courthouse, in the narrow strip of late afternoon light that fell between the building's shadow and the open sky, Vanessa sat in the back of a car that was not her own. Margaret's assistant had arranged it, because Vanessa could not bring herself to sit in the luxury SUV and be driven back through the city as though nothing had changed. She sat with her phone face down in her lap and looked out the window at the streets passing by and said nothing for a long time. She thought about the years. She thought about the morning she had read that email on the laptop, the way the numbers had refused to resolve correctly the first 2 times she read them, the way her brain had resisted what her eyes were telling it. She had convinced herself in the days that followed that speed was the answer, that moving first was the move, that she was the one with the information advantage and the opportunity and the will to act on it. She had not considered the possibility that the man who had never once in their entire marriage moved carelessly had arranged things with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, including this. She thought about the truck. She thought about how she had laughed, standing in that parking lot in the morning light with Claire and Simone and the warm certainty of a day she believed she owned. She thought about what Ethan had said in the courtroom, that he drove it because of what it represented, because some things deserve to be kept for reasons that have nothing to do with market value. She had spent years measuring worth in the wrong units. She had spent years looking at a man who was building something extraordinary and seeing only the gap between where he was and where she wanted him to be, and she had made, from that misreading, the most consequential decision of her life. The car moved through the city. Vanessa looked out the window. She had nowhere urgent to be. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the airfield. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the 2 vehicles parked within 20 feet of him, the company car that Marcus Webb had arranged, clean and black and expensively practical, and the old pickup truck, dented and honest, and carrying on its scratched surface the complete record of a journey from a 2-room office and a borrowed chair and a name no one recognized to a courtroom where a federal judge had just reserved a block of her future calendar to handle the full legal consequences of his success. He opened the truck door. He got in. He sat for a moment with both hands resting on the wheel. Engine still off, the cab quiet around him, and the afternoon light coming in flat and gold through the windshield. He thought about his daughter, Lily. He thought about the specific weight of her the first time they placed her in his arms, a weight unlike anything he had ever lifted before or since. Not because of mass, but because of meaning. He was going to drive to school pickup in less than 3 hours. He was going to pull into the pickup lane in this truck, the way he always did, and Lily was going to climb into the passenger seat and immediately ask whether he had remembered to bring the snack she had requested yesterday and reminded him about twice that morning. He had remembered. She would eat her crackers and tell him about her day in the overlapping, non-chronological, completely and overwhelmingly real way that 7-year-olds narrate their lives, and he was going to listen to every word. That was the fixed point. That was the thing that everything else existed to protect and make possible. The valuation, the jet, the courtroom, the cameras that had been pointed in his direction from the edge of the parking lot, all of it was important, and he would manage it carefully, as he managed everything. But it was not the point. It had never been the point. What Ethan had never done through the months of the filing, the negative characterizations, the public narrative Vanessa had constructed with such careful energy, was give the appearance of a man who was bothered. His employees noticed it. His attorneys had noted it. Daniel Marsh, who had known him for 11 years and could read his moods with the accuracy of long professional intimacy, had mentioned it once in passing. saying that Ethan's ability to compartmentalize was either a great strength or a sign of something complicated he wasn't ready to discuss. Ethan had smiled at that and said it was neither. That he had simply decided early on in the process that reacting to noise was a form of giving it power, and that the things that deserved his energy were the things he was building toward rather than the things being said about where he had been. This was true. And it was also only part of the truth. The other part was that Ethan had spent enough time alone with the reality of what his marriage had become to have moved through the hardest part of it before anyone else in the story had even arrived at the beginning of their own reckoning. He had been grieving in private for a long time. The courthouse morning was not the beginning of anything difficult for him. It was, in its way, the end. He thought about Daniel Marsh, who had called him the previous night after the transaction closed and said, in the clipped, understated way of a man who expressed genuine emotion by choosing his words with extra precision, that it had been worth every hour of it. Ethan had agreed and meant it, and then told Marsh he needed to go because his daughter had a bedtime story request that was apparently non-negotiable. Marsh had laughed and hung up. That had been a good phone call. There had been many good phone calls lately, from investors and board members and old colleagues who had watched from a distance and were now calling with the enthusiastic warmth of people who believed they had always understood what he was capable of, whether they had or not. Ethan had taken each call with the same gracious patience. He understood that success recalibrates memory in interesting ways. He did not hold it against anyone. He simply noted it and moved forward. He started the truck. The engine turned over with a sound that was not beautiful but was completely reliable, the sound of something maintained and valued not for how it appears but for what it does and what it has meant to the person who has driven it through the accumulated mornings of an entire life's work. He pulled out of the space and turned toward the exit and passed, in doing so, within 20 feet of the exact spot where Vanessa had laughed that morning. He did not stop. He did not look. He drove. 3 weeks later, when the court reconvened and Judge Okafor issued her determinations, the outcome would reflect the full weight of what had been presented. The communications would matter. The structure of Meridian systems would matter. The timeline of the filing would matter in precisely the way Beverly Crane had argued it should. Vanessa would receive a settlement that was fair by any objective measure, certainly more than the original plan had imagined possible before the true scale of Ethan's stake became known, but far less than she had set out to claim and arrived at through a process that had exposed, in a courthouse gallery, exactly what the plan had been. She would move to a different part of the city in the following months and would decline, for a long time, any invitations that placed her in rooms where the story might be known. Harrison Burke would not return her calls. Claire and Simone would remain friendly in the distant, infrequent way of people who witness something they would rather not be closely associated with. Life would continue, as it always does, with the ordinary difficulty of starting over. The aircraft on the airfield had begun its taxi to the active runway. It lifted off cleanly, climbing south into the late afternoon, with the effortless authority of something designed to go very high and stay there. From the road, it was briefly audible, and then it was not, leaving behind only the sky it had passed through, which looked exactly as it always had, wide and indifferent, and unchanged by anything that had happened beneath it today or on any other day. Ethan merged into the afternoon traffic, the old truck moving at the pace of everything around it, unremarkable and ordinary to anyone watching from outside, and carrying, as it always had, considerably more than it appeared to. The day she laughed at the old truck was the day she learned that wealth and worth are never the same thing.